Hello, everyone. We're going to give it another minute as our audience zooms in. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lauren Kuby, and I'm going to get started and we'll have some introductions, and I imagine more people will be zooming in as well. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Lauren Kuby with the Stardust Center for Affordable Homes and the Family here at ASU. And Stardust is a center that connects the dots among housing, health, food, access, transportation, even shade, to help craft regional integrated solutions leading to healthy and happy communities. It's my great honor to introduce our moderator, Gabriel Jaramillo, a dear friend of mine. And before starting at Vitalyst, he's the director of healthy communities. Gabriel worked at Habitat for Humanity, Central Arizona for 8 years. He was the director of community development and government relations. And that's how I got to know him so well. He worked with communities to address concerns and needs in their neighborhoods, all the way from the federal level to advocate for affordable housing. So he's worked in the federal, local, state level to be an advocate for affordable housing. He currently sits on the Home Matters to Arizona board. He's vice chair of Phoenix's North Mountain Village Planning Committee, and he leads Valley Leadership's Impact Maker team to address housing and the social determinants of health. So he's quite the busy fellow. He graduated with his BA in history and public history from Grand Canyon University, and he's a Valley Leadership alumni. Gabriel, take it away. And thank you so much for moderating today.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Phil Allsopp. Phil's diverse career in the UK and the US has spanned government service, including the Office of the US Surgeon General, and fields of architecture, public health, geospatial systems, and management consulting. Today, Phil will talk about prevailing supply chain and fragmented business processes typical of urban development and real estate speculation projects, contrasting them with the best practices from advanced product manufacturing and development. Phil?
Well, I unmute. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for everyone for showing up, and it's a pleasure to work with my colleagues on the panel and at ASU. I'm going to be talking about places for human being, and as you can see on the screen, being is singular, and the whole idea there is that it is in fact the act of living and pursuing a life. The system I'm talking about, which is fairly fragmented, has some systemic issues that I believe are eminently addressable, but they need to be done. And I'd like to take you through a fairly short story, which is based on my perspectives and research over the last few years.
And Phil, before you start, I just want to remind our audience, please, if you have any questions, enter them into the Q&A feature. They're on the Zoom link, and Lauren will be feeding them to me so we can ask Phil after his presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've all been hearing a lot about the global challenges that we're all facing, from climate change, most of it human-induced. But one area that's often missed out is the role of human habitat, the places that people inhabit. And it's a key driver of intensifying human and ecological challenges. And the thing about this is that it is the spatial DNA of human habitat that is this powerful driver. And it creates enormous risks to health, well-being, and also commerce. And we're beginning to see that happening in many, many parts of the world, including the United States. This DNA looks rather like this in many cities. If you ask David Attenborough what makes for a successful species, he'll tell you it's habitat. But one of the problems with our species is that we've converted habitat, the places and environments that nurture us and our culture, into real estate commodities, usually to be built on the cheap and sold for the highest price possible. And it's hurting us. It's hurting us broadly. It's hurting us in a number of different ways. Habitat really is not at the center of everything, but it is certainly linked to many other aspects of the, if you like, the genomes, and there's just a few I have on the screen here, relating to energy, agriculture, health, education, economy, and community. You change any one of those, change energy, change health, and you start to impact habitat. Change habitat, you start to impact everything else. This is the DNA that I'm referring to, and the way it's currently organized is not working very well. The global real estate asset value right now is estimated at over $300 trillion worldwide. That's 36 times the value of all the gold that's ever been mined, and 60% of the world's assets, and 75% in housing. And construction spending is 13% of the world's annual GDP. It's a very, very significant energizer of that climate flywheel. And it's also an energizer to the dysfunction in many areas that results in well-being problems, human health problems, and so on. This isn't new. This isn't something that's suddenly happened overnight. It's been happening for the last 100 years. This particular book here, The Crack in the Picture Window, was written by John Keats in 1956. And I won't read everything here. You can read that yourselves. But what he was talking about back then was suburbs destroying established cities and trade patterns, posing dangerous problems for the areas they invade. And obviously, speaking in 1956, he referred to them actually driving mad myriads of housewives shut up in them. It was a major problem that was identified by economists as well as sociologists back then. Probably one of the most poignant set of cartoons that describe where we've come from was done by Robert Crumb in his short history of America. Here we see open prairie and forest, gradual introduction of railways, gradual introduction of human settlement, and over time with the telegraph and the rail and the farm and more houses came along. And then we started to see the streetcars and the trolleys and more things happening over time, to a point where the bottom slide, the bottom image here, looks so much like so many intersections that we experience in our region here in Phoenix, the greater Phoenix region, and anywhere else in the United States. It is a problem. And that, I think, is a result of us converting human habitat into little more than a real estate commodity. One thing that struck me a few years ago was picking up a book called Sunday Afternoon on the Porch. It's actually photographs by a young man at the time, Everett Kunst, who photographed the world around him between 1939 and 1942. And his family found the negatives, got them developed, and made this book. What struck me about this image, though, was the sense of community around a piece of built environment, the wonderful invention of the front porch. There are obviously people who are close to the family, who are on the porch, there are passers-by, and people are smiling. And the thing that truly bothers me about what this conveys is that we've converted this into this. No people, very large entrances designed presumably for extremely tall people who come for dinner, and as many gables as you can possibly imagine, and houses so large you don't even know where your teenage kids are because they can hide anywhere. And when we also look at zoning, the way that we've actually created zoning laws and regulations around the convenience of the automobile, You can see at the top here a shot looking from Google Earth over North Frank Lloyd Wright Boulevard and Thompson Peak Parkway. You can see here that we have oceans of blacktop with buildings in the middle. This shot below is actually a Barcelona, which was laid out in the mid-19th century for health reasons. And that's roughly has the same sort of climate as our region here. But there the buildings are on 45 degrees, not north-south. And the buildings actually surround shaded courtyards. They have a very, very harsh climate, but it's very easy in a city like Barcelona to get around on foot or by car and not suffer from heat exhaustion as you can so easily here. The other thing is that the number of cars per capita in Barcelona is roughly the same as the number of cars per capita in our region here. So it is possible to do things differently and more effectively for human beings. The problem is this, that since 1945, manufacturing and service sectors have actually increased their productivity by over 1,500%, mostly through innovation, not all good, not all positive, but the construction sector is barely pushed past 1%. So that's 1,500% in technology, aerospace, automotive, but the construction sector pretty much hanging around 1%, still doing the same things, very fragmented, very fragile supply chain. A huge underinvestment in design that would be unthinkable in the manufacturing sector, and 4 tons of waste for every 2,000 square feet that's built. So we have a situation with supply chains where we have an enormous array of a layer cake, if you like, of people and organizations that are taking resources away from the quality of what ends up actually being built. You see that on the left-hand side here, squeezing the house down. Maybe 40% to 50% of a total project's cost actually goes into the design, engineering, and construction of the object itself or the construction itself. The rest of it is siphoned away by a whole host of different players, some for good reasons, others not so. And we don't end up with the quality that we need. These photographs here are taken from current construction, and the one on the far right is actually quite close to where I live in Scottsdale. There's nobody on the street. The entrance to the house is just a garage. And the result is soulless places that impoverish the human spirit. But we might have some unsuspecting allies in all of this in terms of coming to grips with how we improve things. Munich Re and Swiss Re foundations, for example, are putting a lot of effort into helping to reshape human habitat for much greater resilience. They're doing some in the Andes region to prevent catastrophes from earthquakes. And in Bangladesh, Swiss Re is working with a number of different organizations to deal with the flooding that occurs every single year, and it's getting worse. So instead of putting barriers up, they're actually creating floating villages that are rather like dry docks for shipbuilding. You build a ship in a dry dock, you flood the dry dock and the ship floats. Well, instead of floating the house out, you're simply allowing the house to float up and down. Excuse me, when I silence this. So the problem for most of the insurance companies is the amount of money that they are pouring out in losses. Swiss Re, for example, was 24 billion that they had to pay out for California's 2019 wildfires. First half of 2021, $42 billion in losses, and 15 to 20 billion for the Texas freeze event last year. Goodness knows what it's going to be this year. So they have a significant interest in built environments that they ensure that currently are not as resilient, fireproof, they're underperforming in many ways, and it really impacts their bottom line. So one of the real problems, say in Paradise, was over 14,000 buildings were destroyed. And the machinery of rebuilding, the machinery of development seems to continue the insanity of repeating what we failed. So it's perpetuating significant health and financial risk because we keep building in the same way, we keep financing in the same way, we keep looking for short-term solutions, and we still overload a typical project with layer cakes of services and individuals for whom it's rather hard to find out exactly what value is really being delivered to the end product. If Boeing did this or Tesla did this, there would be literally, it would cost a fortune to fly from, say, Phoenix to San Francisco, maybe $50,000 round trip. Oops. Seem to have, let me just over advance here. I do that? Yeah. The idea of a regenerative model for human habitat is not new. It goes all the way back to Walter Gropius in 1925, who was arguing very strongly for minimal waste and for the use of manufacturing processes to really improve how we build, how we finance, and how we look after and exert stewardship over our built environments. Mail order kits in Aladdin houses and Sears and Roebuck, I'm sure a lot of you on the call are very aware of that. And then fast forward to the 1980s through to the 2020s, where we started to see the advancement of building information modeling and advanced parametric design systems for doing a better job of figuring out how best to assemble construction. And then when we go over to the far right here, some of the advanced manufacturing in engineered lumber, 3D printed buildings, new types of materials, and in some cases, old types of materials being used in new forms to create new types of structures that work better. And in some cases, these organizations are taking hold of more of the supply chain than just doing the building. They're also taking over the finance as well. So in the end, design, manufacture, fabricate, assemble, and measure. If we do that and innovate, we can then start to improve things. This is what I'm referring to in terms of a regenerative model. Applying best practices, we can see that if we were to go into a Boeing plant or a Tesla plant, they produce multiple types of products. But in construction, everything is on a site. It tends to be messy. There's a lot of waste. There are plenty of technologies available today which prevent that kind of waste and enable us to do a far better job. Some of the software technologies that are available coming online emanate from genomics, and on the right-hand side of this particular slide, you can see something up there called the Galapagos algorithm, developed by David Rutan. He's an architect out of Vienna who's done a huge amount of work in parametric programming, literally software coding. And this particular instance here is was used by the city of Irkutsk in Russia to figure out how to make a neighborhood walkable. Where would the park go? Where would the restaurant go? Where would the childcare center go? Where would the community center and library go? Rather than guesswork, they actually use genomics algorithms to figure out the best one in order to elevate the walk score from what was 46% to close to 96%. And on the left-hand side here, you'll see something out of the company in New York called AI Space Factory, who are pioneering 3D printed structures, not only for Mars, but also for Earth. So there's a lot of innovation taking place on the technology and materials side, but very little of it is actually seeing the light of day in terms of the scalability that we need in order to address the housing crisis and the crisis in building construction in general. Another group, HYPAR, is doing a huge amount of work in simulation. And this is designed to take the guesswork out of what we design and what we build. Right now, we're doing the equivalent of riding a motorbike on a moonless night along Big Sur Highway in California, hoping that somehow, with the lights off, hoping that we won't fall into the ocean. So most buildings are, in fact, experimental prototypes that we hope we get right. There are plenty of new technologies available, readily available today, as well as manufacturing technologies, which give a much better set of options for designers, developers, and municipalities to do a much better job, rather than just keep repeating the same model that we see so often today. We can also go from plants to people. Hemp on the bottom, forest on the right, combine both through smart design to do a much, much better job of precision assembly. Again, merging forest and agricultural waste streams with advanced product design and manufacturing. That is entirely possible. It is happening in other countries. There's no reason why it can't happen here, but it does require upfront investment, that's for sure. One of the things that we've seen, and I've seen certainly, is well-intended policies are often derailed by a one-way process. For example, a policy priority might be human health and well-being, prosperity, and so on, all very good things, but we still have financial incentives from the banking system for short-term investment returns. Zoning and planning, even though those zoning and planning laws are changing, they're still dominated by regulations that separate use and function, and they focus on automobile convenience. We see this pretty much everywhere. So what does a city do? It tends to identify land parcels that could be up for development, and there's an invitation to developers and architects to suggest built environment projects. But the assumption is that that one-way process, which is here's an opportunity, let's design something here, will actually result in environments that really do work. This isn't to say that people aren't trying their best, but I think they're laboring under a very fragmented and very, very inefficient system that, if it were made more efficient, would yield much better results. So if we were able to have a wish list, at least if I had a wish list, it would be that we would have much stronger financial incentives in the insurance industry and in the banking industry to fund the cycle of designing and building and learning more about the process by which we have created an environment, and learning more about what worked and what didn't work. Because at the moment, it's a one-shot deal. And I think, as I mentioned in the very beginning, it was the chief design officer of Apple some years ago was interviewed and said that what they were trying to do with the Apple headquarters in Cupertino was to avoid the problem of having an experimental prototype of a building that never went into production. So they used manufacturing production techniques to design that. And that can be applied on a larger scale, and there's no reason why it can't be applied to housing. We already know that we're hundreds of thousands of units short of where we need to be. Last time I looked, I think the city of Phoenix was about 163,000 odd units short. So we have a crisis that we do need to deal with. My apologies for here. So my thought is that our spatial DNA needs fixing. We need gene therapy for human habitat. And I believe that we have the opportunity to leverage technology and to enable a much more regenerative, circular economy around housing and human habitat to be in place, where financial services and the financing around development are inextricably welded to the process of design and raw materials and manufacturing and fabrication and assembly. And that we take the elements of use and performance evaluation and have the system learn from that so that we can improve the next time we do something. Keeping things fragmented is impoverishing so many people in the entire supply chain from doing the best work they can. And I think if we take the opportunity to really leverage this technology so that we can gain much more foresight in what we should be doing, we'll end up with a situation where affordability becomes the norm and not the exception. I think for the moment, I'll end it here and open up this to any questions you all may have.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Well, I did want to ask you, I know with my former employer, Habitat for Humanity, we can be to build and address some of the more, I guess, experimental types of building. 3D printing is something that you had mentioned. Can you talk a little bit more about the potential of 3D printing, that process, and the use of various types of material? We know there's, you know, a concrete element, that we know there's polymers and a couple of other various types of material.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah. The 3D printing at the moment is using, in some cases, using Portland cement, which is not very smart because, you know, there's some problems with the carbon footprint that cement has. But some of the most appealing from an ecological perspective are the biopolymers. For example, in our region here, you drive out on Interstate 8 toward California, and you'll find thousands of acres of basalt laying around. Well, basalt fiber is almost as strong as carbon fiber. And when that is entrained in a biopolymer like polylactic acid, which is derived from vegetable matter waste, you end up with the same material that AI Space Factory was using to actually build their NASA example for habitats on Mars. And it seems to me that that kind of technology could be deployed much more widely. Instead of having an agricultural waste stream that gets buried or can be used for fertilizer, which is fine, maybe some of that can actually be used for creating new types of biopolymers. There's a company here in Phoenix that's actually making epoxies out of vegetable waste that's stronger than the epoxies coming out of hydrocarbons. So Portland cement, fine. There are other materials that you can look at. I'm doing quite a bit of work with the University of Plymouth in the UK on 3D printed cob, which is clay and straw. Goes back hundreds of years, thousands of years, in fact. And there are many aspects of how we used to build as a species that would be worthwhile revisiting, especially when you combine smart computational design technology with manufacturing technology and those materials, which are non-toxic.
No, it was a great conversation, like you were saying. So, and also for the sustainability aspect, I know one of the parts, one aspect that we were discussing is how we can use recycled plastics, maybe not the same type of biopolymers, but, you know, a recycled plastic aspect of it for those polymers. We have a couple of questions from the group here. You know, you discussed a lot about building layouts and materials and building processes. Are large organizations like the American Institute for Architecture or the National Association of Home Builders pushing for legislation and policy change or funding, are funding for more, for moving into new production methods associated with training? And, you know, are you aware of any pursuit of that?
Yeah, the Royal Institute of British Architects, of which I'm still a member after all these years. In fact, I'm a member on the board with RIBA USA. Yes, they are pushing for these things. But again, we have the professions like the AIA and the RIBA and other professional bodies are the tail wagging an enormous monster that has a lot of inertia with it. So we have highly qualified, very well experienced, dedicated professionals in engineering, the design and construction sectors who want to do and know they can do more things. But we have financial mechanisms that find very effective ways of depressing the ability to actually bring those types of technologies and materials to the fore. But I do think, though, that for some of the banking organizations and certainly the big property casualty insurers who are currently leaking billions, they could play a very, very effective role in bringing the longer term aspects of project financing into line with the possibilities that exist now to do a much better job.
Interesting. And that's something that we've discussed a lot, is the incentive, both financial incentive and the opportunity, the financial opportunities for these types of projects. And I know you had touched on zoning as well, and opening up the opportunities for new materials within zoning and best practices of construction in cities, throughout the state. There's a follow-up question here. Can you talk a little more about the importance and feasibility of locally produced building materials?
Yes.
Localities seek to shore in their supply chains. Is that possible anywhere?
Yes, it is. It is. For example, in Arizona, we have 18.6 million acres of forest, and I'm not suggesting we strip the forest for wood for building, but the forest density is so high that we have fire risk that's extremely high. So some of the small diameter lumber could be pulled from those forests and used very effectively to create engineered timber solutions locally here in Arizona. The other aspect of locally produced materials could be industrial hemp, which has been around for multiple generations. In fact, there's a bridge over one of the rivers in southern France that's made of hempcrete. That's basically lime and hemp herds. I and my colleagues have done a lot of research on just how much acreage is actually required for building square footage. And we have good climates for it. There's a lot of research that needs to be done in terms of where industrial hemp, for example, could be effectively farmed. Is it up on the rim or is it down in the valley? There's a lot of, obviously, biologists who would know a lot more about that than I do. But locally produced materials would make an awful lot of sense. I do remember, for example, seeing a construction project here and a truck going into the construction site with 2x4s or 2x6s, and each of those 2x4s and 2x6s had product of Austria on it. There is something absolutely mad about that.
I agree, and thank you for that. And like I said, there's a lot of resources here in Arizona, and there's some innovative processes going on right now. I would like to remind our audience, please submit questions, any questions that you would have for Mr. Allsopp. We appreciate it. We'll get to them as they come in. Phil, I wanted to ask you a little bit, kind of pertaining to some of these underlying questions of supply chain or addressing the affordable housing issue that Arizona's in. You had mentioned Phoenix is 160 units short, the state's over 250 units short of affordable housing. What's that? 250,000. Sorry, yes, 250,000. Yeah, short throughout the state. So that's crisis level, absolutely. Currently, there's been a bill introduced in both chambers. I believe it's HB 2674 that describes by right zoning for and supported by the multifamily housing development community. And the bill is portraying that local processes are the reason for the lack of affordable housing. You had identified a couple of the other underlying issues, such as supply chain issues, proliferation of short-term rentals, and outline inclusionary zoning, a couple of different things. What is your opinion on that?
I think it's well-intentioned and is trying to shorten the process of getting approvals. My only worry about it is if all that happens is that we keep doing the same thing faster, we're not necessarily changing what we're doing sufficiently to create better solutions. Holdups, municipal holdups are really problematic. But I think until we come to grips with the local manufacture and precision assembly of better materials and components for construction, no matter how quickly you make an approval process, it's not going to change the outcome, I don't believe. It's not badly intentioned, don't get me wrong, but I think there's more to, shall we say, fix in the broken and fragmented process than just making it easier to get a planning approval done for a particular project. Again, when we have a broken system where we have layer cakes of intermediaries between where the money comes from and the people actually doing the design and engineering and construction, that tends to compress the amount of money that's available for doing anything. And so expediency tends to reign supreme rather than doing what most of the professionals in construction, design, and engineering know they could be doing.
So let me ask you, what would be needed, I guess, first? You had discussed some of the financial incentives for learning, expanding, exploring some of that. And we talk about local zoning, that regenerative model of habitat that you had mentioned earlier, that the new types of buildings, the new types of material. But in order to achieve that, we need that research to show, but we need the incentive there. How much of a role, or walk us through that process as you would see what's needed first?
I think there are several organizations in our state and other states too. And I think somehow we collectively need to approach the property casualty insurers and the banking system to have conversations about what's really needed. How do we make our property casualty insurers, as well as the reinsurers like Swiss Re, Munich Re, and Zurich Re, how do we make them partners in developing solutions that work for long term, as opposed to work for a few years and then fall apart because they're just not up to scratch? I think engaging with that community could be very important. It's in their self-interest as well, because the more they have to pour money out in shoring up catastrophic problems with built environments, either through flood, through fire, through death, or what have you, or injury, the more incentive they have to come up with a better solution that is lower risk, higher performance throughout its entire life.
Thank you. And along the same lines, this is a question from the audience. To what extent does changing the building materials / practices alter how construction workers actually do their work? If so, how quickly can workers or companies and managers actually train people to adapt to these changes?
The new materials are not necessarily difficult. I mean, in some of the materials, like some of the engineered lumber materials that I mentioned on this particular slide, for example, then you're talking about a screw gun and leveling devices. But overall, I think it's important that the restructuring of this entire process, where you begin to integrate much more closely financing, design, manufacture, assembly, and so on, that we rekindle the notion of good craftsmanship, that it's not just labor coming in with a hammer or a screwdriver to assemble something, that we need to somehow energize people that we refer to as tradesmen, but actually tradesmen and women, they're actually craftsmen in the end. And I think there is a huge opportunity to engage populations who want to build something in a process that involves them actually using their head, using their talent to do things that actually work. So I think there's some retraining, obviously, but I don't think that the average person wants to work at doing a job that's not well done. But if they're given the opportunity to become master craftsmen and master craftswomen in a particular area that they enjoy doing, and that it's safe and that they can create great structures, I would imagine the uptake might be quite surprising.
Well, I appreciate that. I know that was, when we were having the discussions about new polymers and the construction of a 3D home, the idea there's still electricians, there's still plumbers that are still be involved. But within that, there's also the opportunity for technical training for the technician behind the 3D printer, for quality assurance and that aspect. So there still is a lot of opportunity for that. We've got another question from the audience for you here. Oh, go ahead.
One quick thing. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I also think engaging those craftsmen, the electricians, the plumbers, in the process of making even the 3D printing process better for them too is important, as opposed to doing a design and hoping that the plumber and the electrician can make it work. They need to be engaged in the process. They're valuable professionals who need to be embraced as part of the entire design team, just like NASA does it with spaceships. And if we can do, something as fantastic as the James Webb spacecraft, there's no, and knit all of those hexagons together for the main mirror, there's no reason why we can't do the same thing here.
It is amazing how those, I think they refer to them as systems. So the bathroom system, the kitchen system, how they all act and connect, and how they're in the design aspect, even from starting at the design aspect, to make sure that each one of them is at the table to articulate how to best implement that system within the broader home itself, or the structure itself. Those are amazing conversations that, like you said, everybody needs to be at the table for.
Absolutely.
We have a few more questions here. There was mentioned that in Phoenix, there's hundreds of thousands of homes throughout the state, 250,000 home shortage, affordable home unit shortage. Based off your knowledge, where are the critical intervention points for addressing the supply issue?
I think it's in the availability of land, 2, the availability of easy to assemble systems that can be built in a matter of a few short weeks, as opposed to months on end. I mean, if you look at how housing, it doesn't have to be a quote affordable housing, and I think all housing ought to be affordable, quite frankly. But there are plenty of instances where, if you like, pre-designed, I wouldn't say modular so much, but simply pre-designed buildings, which can be componentized, can be assembled in a matter of a few short weeks, as opposed to taking months on end, and then having half the workforce walk off because somebody else in another part of town is offering them an extra couple of dollars per an hour in order to do that. We need one of the critical factors, I think, is the assemblage of a task force that involves the craftsmen and women, the design professionals, the engineering professionals, and the banks, to say, okay, we are a task force and we're going to go after this and we're going to stick with it and do it. So land availability, certainly, density, how do the various housing units, do they all have to be single family units, or can they be quad units, back to backs? There are plenty of examples from around the world that can be looked at in terms of the applicability of that in the Phoenix area. I've done some, other people have done some research into that, and there are plenty of different types of approaches for that. But it's a question of thinking out the box too, from instead of looking at everything as a micro version of a single family home. Look at some of the things that were done decades ago here and in other countries to help solve a housing crisis. And I think there's plenty of opportunity there.
Well, and speaking of an opportunity to, I guess, reassess or take a broader perspective, another question from the audience: how might the pandemic opened up thinking toward more regenerative design for living and dwelling environments, not just more sustainable and affordable, but more healthful and for habitation?
Yeah, I think the pandemic, it's a double-edged sword, and without getting into the politics of it all, but for the first time in a very long time, people have actually had to be and inhabit the houses that they buy or rent. They actually have to be there. They literally live there. They have to work out of it in some fashion or another. And I think it's brought home to them some of the serious shortfalls in how house configurations or housing configurations simply don't work. There might be a 2 or 3 bedroom or 4 bedroom formula within the real estate marketing community that says, well, this is what we've always done, but it may not work for a lot of people. So I think there's been a much greater appreciation for what housing can do. When we have such incredibly hot summers, where for some folks in houses that don't perform well, they were probably never really designed for this climate, except for maybe having an air conditioner system strapped to it. Disturbed sleep patterns are a significant health risk. If you have disturbed sleep because you can't sleep, it's too hot for more than 2 or 3 days at a time, the average fit human being will experience elevated waking appetites of up to 40% greater than when they had normal sleep. And the craving is for carbohydrates and sugars. And so the interplay between human health and well-being and the physical places that we occupy, one, are very apparent, and two, I think have been recognized more broadly by people surviving and maintaining life during this pandemic.
Excuse me, can I interrupt, Phil? Can you take down your PowerPoint so we can see your lovely face?
Oh, you can't see me? Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Phil. It really has opened up that discussion on what a home and how a home is and how you interact with it. And in my work here at Vitalyst, we talk about the environment, our community design, healthy community design, even walkability and access to food. And so it really has changed the focus on what that environment looks like.
Yeah. I think too that over the last couple of years, people have been thinking more and more about the nature of where we live. I mean, they're beginning to notice more about the environment and the streets they live on. And I think the more you look at it, the more it's fairly clear that what we need is shelter, energy, food, and water and communication security. And we don't have that yet. But we could if we reconfigured and reshaped the ways and means by which we create human habitat.
Absolutely. Thank you, Phil. We have got more questions from the audience coming in. I'll address those. Again, audience, please let us know if you have any other questions. Phil, on the topic of locally sourced building material, how prevalent is the reuse of material in spaces? You had mentioned the construction of a 2,000 square foot home created 4 tons of waste.
Mm-hmm.
Can this waste be reduced, repurposed, used for other things? How could you see that waste being used again?
By a much tighter integration of design technologies to eliminate waste. There's a term that's used in my field called digital twinning, where in a computer, you're literally creating a digital twin of exactly what will get built. Automotive does it, aerospace does it, NASA does it all the time. It's the only way they succeed in what they do. But in built environments, we're still a little bit of ways from what a true digital twin is. So a digital twin will enable volumes of materials to be precisely identified, purchased and supplied, as opposed to wasted and cut up on site. So that's number one. And the other one was the reuse of materials. Some of the organic materials like timber could be repurposed and reused for making engineered timber, OSB, or what have you. Bricks as well. We don't tend to use as much in the way of bricks as we could. But also we still tend to automatically use an awful lot of Portland cement even for stucco. You've often seen these 5-6 story house, multifamily apartments. They put the stucco on the outside, and then about 5 days later it all cracks, and then they plaster it over again, sell it quickly, and then it's up to the poor hapless owners to fix it when it next happens. If we used something as simple and as ancient as hydraulic lime, that problem would go away. But you know, some of the use of Portland cement is often built into the construction regulations themselves, and so we built in an awful lot of impediments to how things get done. But we could be doing a lot more recycling. There's a company in New York that's actually recycling brick and creating new brick from it. I can't remember the name, but they're doing some really interesting work.
I believe I saw something similar with Elon Musk in the tunnel. At the same time that they were taking the earth out, they were making the earthen bricks that were extremely cheap, durable. So it's always interesting ways to use the material, you know, what would be traditionally considered waste material. So it'd be interesting to explore that as well.
Right.
We have more questions from our audience here. As a municipal advocate, I had been trying to have our cities to allow prototypes, specifically 3D printed, but we always run up against zoning requirements. Any suggestions to bring this tech to people who can see it, to hopefully become and get popular support for it? So how do you build support around these initiatives, these innovative initiatives for addressing housing?
What we don't have at the moment is the equivalent of a visual time machine that shows regulators and municipalities the consequences of doing the same thing versus changing. We have flight simulators in the gaming world. We have flight simulators certainly for airlines, commercial airlines, and military, but we don't have flight simulators for urban design. And the consequences of zoning requirements, for example, in California, there's one where you can divide a 5,000 square foot lot into two. Unfortunately, the zoning requirements for parking and for setbacks are exactly the same. So when you divide the lot, you basically create a heat island with all the concrete. So I think being able to illustrate the environmental and human well-being consequences of maintaining zoning restrictions that were originally designed decades ago for automobile convenience and the single-family home American dream, I think illustrating that would be a very important step toward getting relief from some of those more draconian zoning requirements.
And I would just add, to keep advocating. We know cities like the city of Tempe has partnered with Habitat for Humanity Central Arizona to do the 3D printed home out there. I know there's initiatives like at the city of Phoenix that I believe, I could be wrong on this, but I believe they have designated a single lot through an RFP process dedicated for experimental material use. Again, it's going to be on a very small scale, but I think, you know, the more this gets brought up, alternative building materials get brought up as a feasible option to address housing, there's going to be more interest in it. So we're seeing that. So I would just recommend keep bringing it up. It's working. You know, there's definitely more openness to this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you know what? Nobody wants to do a bad job, no matter which part of the spectrum you look at. I mean, everybody wants to do a better job. Everyone wants to see a better life. It's just a question of just advocating for the extraordinary rather than the ordinary.
Absolutely. And so I hate to say this is our last question. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. But from our audience, we all need to contact our state legislators and federal legislators to require more energy and water efficient buildings. Starting from our state and federal buildings, there is much money to be saved and job opportunities. We can also do the same with commercial and residential developers. Is ASU working with any legislators to make policies or law to this point?
Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean to say I just haven't looked. So I would imagine that through the Global Futures Lab, there are various individuals and groups that are engaged in some of these discussions. But it's important that the academic community be part of this transformation that needs to happen. Particularly, I mean, one of the simple things in water recirculation and recycling. Netherlands requires it for every home. You can save up to between 45 and 60% of your water with devices that just sort of about the same size of a refrigerator. That's about it. And we need it here. Well,
and so I may have lied. And so one more question here. It kind of expands on that. Can you elaborate on the politics of it all around the sustainability and all this? And they're wondering how politics and the power dynamics can help or hinder the transformation of housing development practices. Just kind of wrap it all up for us. And
sure. The fundamental thing about what we're talking about is a democratic process. The involvement of everybody, the involvement of specialists, the involvement of generalists, the involvement of communities, the attention to the facts of life regarding the impact of human habitat on people's lives, on ecology, on climate. Those are real. They're truth. They're not they're not pieces of fake news. I know that politics are pretty toxic at the moment in a lot of areas, but I think when you speak to any legislator who has an interest in the well-being of their children and grandchildren and their children, and you look at what you're trying to do, what I've been advocating for and working at, and many others are doing, we're trying to make a better world. And the only way we can do that is to have everybody's involvement. We need, 1 million people asking about this stuff, 1 million people getting enthusiastic about the places they live and noticing how they can make small improvements that would make all the difference in the world to them and their neighbors. That's a democratic process.
That's a great note to end on. I appreciate your time with us today, Phil. Thank you to the audience for all the great questions. I want to hand it over to our host Lauren Kuby, for closing comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. And can you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes.
I hope yes. So thank you so much, Phil and Gabe, for a scintillating discussion about the good and bad and ugly of housing policy materials, dynamics. Really appreciate it. I want to turn your attention to a talk we're having tomorrow with two very well-known urban planners, James Rojas and John Camp, and they're going to talk about their new book, Dream, Play, Build, Hands-on Community Engagement for Enduring Spaces and Places. And Deirdre Pfeiffer from the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning will be leading the discussion. And we're going to learn new insights into community engagement and what is the best practices, best examples of real meaningful community engagement around the housing space. So that's tomorrow, same time, same place. Please register so you get the link. It's tomorrow at 12 o'clock. And with that, we'll sign off. And thank you, folks, for all of the great questions and for the discussion today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.